In the last video we had a look at rhythmical concepts. Today I want to have a look at melodies. Because apart from the rhythmical concepts that I've been using in this particular project, there's also a lot of melodic stuff that I'm doing that is very interesting. Now, I've always been a big fan of using melodic elements, but in the last few productions that I've been doing, I found myself more and more using them in different creative ways. And this final production over here is definitely a good example of that. So when it comes to melodic elements, there's a few different things that you can mean. So for example, over here we have a simple arp. I say simple, but as you can see, there's a lot of automations and other things happening. But you can hear that melodically speaking, this is a very simple idea. I just have a very basic step-back patch that you can see over here, which I'm using to generate the melody, which means that we just have this melody that repeats every bar. So that's a very simple arp, and I would say that in a part like this, it is really kind of like a backing element. So you can hear how this element sits in the background and it just adds a little bit of extra tension, a little bit of extra energy towards the end of the part here. And the main melodic element in here is actually something that I'm doing with this vocal line, which is just kind of going up one semitone every once in a while. And that is mimicked with these brass stabs that I have over here, which help add extra impact to that idea. So these are the brass stabs. And you can hear that when I'm playing them together, they're both essentially the same melodic idea. Now you can hear that this is still a very basic melodic idea in the sense that we just have this one note playing from here. And then we have this little accent note, one semitone higher, and then it goes back into the root note of the key. In this case, that root note is F sharp. But the main thing that I want to talk about today is stuff like this. So for example, here we have a flute, which is a melodic idea. Or stuff like this vocal pad over here. The cool thing about these kind of elements is that through the melody you can kind of dictate the flow and the energy level of your track. So I'm just going to play this part in its entirety so you can hear what it actually sounds like in the context of the track. And notice how both of these melodic elements help with pushing the track forwards into a new section and raising the energy level of that section and just overall transitioning into the next part of the track. One of the ways that I've been doing this is by considering the start of the new section to be kind of like a home base, something that you want to go to with your melody. And the way that I'm doing that is by playing a version of this vocal pad over here that is just in this one key here that sounds very stable, it sounds very homey. Like from a melodic standpoint, I cannot really explain it in music theory terms because I don't know any music theory, but the way that I've written this, it feels like the melody is kind of naturally coming to an end here. As you can hear if I play this last part over here. Just quickly looking at this melody, you can see that this isn't really the root key. So it's not like I'm trying to go back to F sharp, which is the root note. We're just in a D here, which is actually one semitone above the perfect fifth, I believe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes. So C sharp would be the perfect fifth from the root note. And then if we go one more, you can see that we are in D. And that is actually the note that we're going to with this melody. As I said, I don't really know music theory, so I cannot explain it with the way that things resolve and stuff like that. But it just feels like this note is a very nice kind of note to end on. And it's obviously going to depend on the different parts of the track and the different elements that you're playing, whether this is going to work well or not. And it's going to be just like the last video in that I'm just going to experiment a lot with the melody and play around a lot with the melody. Usually I have to let it rest for a while and then just listen to it a bunch of times, see if I like it after listening to it a bunch of times, seeing if it exactly tells the kind of story that I want to tell. And what I mean by story in this case is really just kind of like the flow of energy. How is the energy going throughout this melody, right? We start pretty low over here and we end at a very high point. That matches the energy because the energy of the rest of the elements is also rising. Now here I have another example. This is the same kind of vocal pad, just playing a different melody. Again, I'm adapting the melody specifically to the part of the track that it's actually playing in. So this is this melody. Now again, a little disclaimer, as I said before, I'm experimenting a lot with different things. So whenever I'm explaining something the way that we're doing it now, when I'm analyzing something, that's not actually the way that I think. This is just the idea I formed of what I was doing after analyzing the part that I actually wrote. But this isn't how I was thinking when I wrote the actual piece. But analyzing this, what you'll notice this melody is that one, it has a very distinct rhythm in that it's a long note and then 2 bar notes here. So we have 2 bars, 1 bar, 1 bar, 2 bar, 1 bar, and kind of this 1 bar thing here because there's a glide note in here. And in fact, even in these 1 bar parts, they actually glide around. Whereas over here, you can see the note kind of comes to a stop before the next note starts to play. So it won't actually connect and it won't actually glide into the next note, which essentially means that we have a 2 bar repeating pattern here of note starts to play and note stops to play towards the end here, which, if you remember the last video, lines up neatly with the drum loop that we have over here, in that it stopped towards the end here. There's a very clear stop happening here, and that is actually the rhythmical idea for this part of the track over here. So for one, this melody is kind of already setting up the rhythm, at least it is helping with that. And what I wanted to do over here is I wanted to rise, first of all. I wanted this to have a rising quality because we have risers over here. So I wanted to have the musical idea kind of match the energy and the tension that I was building with the other elements. And then over here, I wanted to land on another very stable, very homey feeling note, like you're at rest, like you're at home. I don't know, that's just the way that I like to describe it. To be honest, I don't really know any better way to describe it. If there is a better way, then please let me know. But you can feel that this note, it really feels like it kind of naturally follows from the progression. It naturally should be there, and it feels nice when this note starts to play. And that is very crucial because we don't want this to be very distracting. We don't want this note to be very out of place, to say, because there's a vocal on here and I want the listener to specifically listen to this vocal because that's what's actually carrying the information of the story of the track. This vocal is actually important for the theming of the track, so I don't want the melody to distract from that. So this melody feels very stable here, and then finally we want another like small whip over here to add a little bit of extra energy before this final vocal shout hits and we go back into the drop and we start dancing again. Now another trick that I've been implementing in terms of my melodic ideas is this thing over here. I believe I also covered this in the last video, but what I'm essentially doing is I have a whole bunch of different notes in different MIDI clips and I just move them around and experiment until I find the rhythm that I like. When it comes to the notes themselves though, they are just kind of random notes, as I said. But what you can see is that we have this go down, go up, go down, go up kind of motion to it. That's kind of what I was aiming for. I want it to be constant movement. What you don't want is have a situation where you have something like this and then it plays the same note after it again. To me, musically, that is just not a very interesting idea, and just constantly moving around the notes with this random, unpredictable rhythm is much more interesting. So this sounds somewhat like this. Again, you'll notice that we're ending on the key of the track, the root note here, which is again feeling very stable, feeling very at home. It feels very nice to end the phrasing there. If I were to end the phrasing like this, it would feel out of place. Like it feels like a sentence that isn't finished, if you know what I mean. So we need this final note here to kind of go back home to just finalize the phrasing of this melodic idea. And you'll notice also rhythmically that this note is playing at the so-called division point. For those that don't remember, whenever you have a section of track, say that we have this 8-bar section over here, you can make divisions. So this is going to be the first division. This part and this part over here are going to be the second division. And you'll see that this note has an impact from the second division over here. And you can continuously divide up more and more and more. And with enough divisions, you'll eventually get to these other notes as well. But you can see that these aren't exactly placed to have impacts from specific points. Even this one looks like it's very close to this like second division over here. But it's actually having an impact half a beat in front of it as opposed to right on top of it. So it's going to have a different groove, it's going to have a different feel because of that, as obviously it no longer lines up with the kick and that's now on the offbeat instead. And that's true for some of the other notes as well, while others just don't align neatly with a division point. So for example, over here, this would be a third division, you would have a fourth division over here, and then you would need to make a fifth division point to actually get to this note over here. You can see that I'm using that once more over here, where I'm working on a new idea. This isn't finalized yet. I'm not entirely happy with how the melody and how the flow of this idea goes, but we're essentially combining the sitar that we heard before with the flute that we heard in the very beginning of the video to something that sounds like this. And here's the sequence that we made in the last video that we're going into. You'll notice that when we're going into this sequence over here, this sequence is very tied to the root note. As we designed this in the last video, we have 3 notes that are actually the root of the key here. And then we have this perfect fifth over here as well. So again, this is a very stable, very homey sounding chord. And we're going into that by again finishing the melody on the root of the key. So on F sharp over here. And the sitar is also playing an F sharp in this point. So you can imagine that melodically, this element combines with this element because they are playing the same thing. Because the other melody kind of resolves into this sequence over here. It kind of resolves into the same note as this sequence starts to play that note very strongly. Now I would consider this kind of like my producer tag. This is my kind of sound, I would say. These little melodic ideas that help the track move forward in a way, or that just add a little bit of extra interest to particular parts in the track. I really like doing these kind of things. But first of all, this might not be for you. This might not be the kind of sound that you want to go for. And second of all, it would be a little bit annoying for you guys to all start copying what I do now that I found a sound that I really like and that I really want to be mine. Of course, I cannot stop you guys, and if I didn't want that to be the case, I shouldn't have made this video. But what I do want to do is take a little bit of time to talk about how you would go about finding a sound like this, finding your signature sound like this. Because I can sit here and I can explain everything that I do, but that doesn't really explain to you how you would go about the process of finding something that is unique, that sticks out, and that works for you. And truth be told, this is not something that you will find in one track. So we have analyzed this track over here, but it didn't start with this track over here. As you can imagine, your sound is something that should be continuously changing and should be continuously evolving as you progress as a musician and become better in making music, but also because you're acquiring new taste, because you start to like different things that you hear in maybe in other people's music or that you hear yourself doing while you're producing. All of those things obviously have an influence on the sound that you end up having. And my very first tip is just knowing what you like. And in order to do that, you need to listen to a lot of music. Not just to other people's music to get inspired and to tune your ears, but also to your own music to identify what you like and more importantly, what you don't like. Now this is where these things come in. This is a very handy tool if you're a music producer. This is just Bluetooth headphones for those that are newer. Whenever I'm doing chores, whenever I'm doing laundry or dishes or something like that, or whenever I have to get groceries, I just have these in and I listen to either my own music to make judgments on different things that I like or not like, or to get inspired for maybe a production session that I have coming up by listening to other people's music. My second tip is to have a notebook where you note things down. This is just very useful to do so that you remember the ideas that you have, especially if you cannot implement them. Say, for example, you're listening to the track over and over again, but you're doing chores or you're busy doing something else, or maybe you don't have the project open or you're working on a different project than that you're listening to. You can just note things down, write them down, and then remember for the actual production session where you want to implement them. Now, while you're listening for the things in your track that you like or not like, you should think about how you can implement that as a system. what can you identify of the elements that you can reproduce in maybe your next track, so that you can also have your sound in other tracks, because that is one of the identifiers of it being your sound. It's not just limited to one track. These are ideas that consistently come back into your music. You need to ask yourself, what kind of things can I do to consistently have these same ideas, but have them different enough so that it's clearly two different ideas in two different tracks. Now, obviously, this is going to depend on the idea itself. Maybe it's a sound design idea, maybe it's a mixing idea, maybe it's a particular type of transition, maybe it's a particular type of fill idea that you like, or maybe it's just like me, a particular type of sound or a particular way of using a sound. So what I want to do is I want to show you a few other examples of where I'm using my sound in different production projects. So here's the first example. Here we are in the production project of my upcoming release, Eternal Garden. Now, this track is actually the opener to my first ever live set. I would highly appreciate it if you guys would go check that out over on the Eclipse channel, as watch time is one of the key factors for the YouTube algorithm, and we can use every bit of help in that regard. So thank you in advance for checking that out. And this track really revolves, at least at the start, around this melody over here. And the interesting thing about this melody is the way that I wrote it is I started, I believe, with a 4-bar loop, and then I duplicated that over and made a lot of different changes to it to really just set that apart from what was happening before, so that we essentially get this 8-bar melody. And then I duplicated it over one more time to over here, and then I made some very small changes between this last bit over here and this bit over here, so that yes, it kind of has this 16-bar length in terms of how long the repeating sequence actually is, but it feels a little bit more like 8 bars, because the differences between the first 8 bars and the last 8 bars are so small. Now, this is obviously something that I can reproduce. This is a sound that I can have again, right? I can do the same setup, I can use a similar kind of plucky sound, and I can just make an ARP like this again and use something very, very similar in my music to develop that as my sound. Now, I didn't end up doing that. I didn't end up reusing this kind of technique to develop my sound further. But what I do have over here is the very first example of a flute melody in my tracks. So going down over here, we have these flute melodies over here. And this particular flute is doing something very, very familiar in that it is very tight around the root note and it also finishes there. It kind of goes back home like we saw before. But just by looking at this other example over here, this other part over here, we can see that it's not entirely that simple, in that this flute over here is the same flute, it's an octave higher, but it doesn't resolve like the other one does, like it does in the clip, but I removed that part of the clip. So you can hear that here in the track, it doesn't actually like really fully resolve the musical idea within the track. You can kind of hear that the melody gets cut off completely at the end here, and there's a lot more space left for the ARP in here. So this is just a different writing style, but you can see that it's not really my sound yet. I guess the main observation that you could make in here is that, yes, I'm using melodies in my track, but I'm not yet using these melodies to actually progress the idea of the track, to actually progress the energy level of the track. Now here we are in the next project that I want to show. Here we have one flute example that I want to show. And the reason for that is this is the first time that I could find where I'm actually using a melody to kind of design a flow like we saw before. In that first project that we saw a whole bunch of different examples of where I was doing that. But in this case, this is the first one. As you can see, it's no longer this repeating melody like we saw in the last project, that slower project. As you can see, it's no longer the kind of melody like we saw in Eternal Garden, which had much more of a repeating feeling to it and much less of a flowy feeling. But you can hear that this one really is kind of like a flow throughout the melody. Now I would assume with this melody that over here is the point where the next section starts, in the sense of the next drop section, the next section of the track. But that's not really true. It actually happens over here. So you can see we are flowing kind of down and then back up with the melody to this point over here. But there's no actual major change happening on this point yet. Now listening to the melody again, especially this last part, you can hear that there's a little bit of a sweep up happening over here. So let's have a listen. In the sense that it holds the note, but it feels like the note becomes slightly louder towards the end here. And what that means is that this actually slides into the section, as opposed to the note starting right here, which would start the root note on that section, which is what we saw before. So in the context of the track, you can hear that it's still not 100% adding to the flow of the track. So that brings us to the final project, in which we will actually see a melody that actually helps with the flow of the track. By the way, this track is actually the closer for that same live set that I mentioned earlier. So it's very interesting how that goes, I guess. Anyway, let's get back into it. So you can see it's a very simple melody. We have a bar of a stable note over here, and then we have a little melodic idea that flows into the next bar of a stable note over here. We have another little melodic idea over here, and then at the start of the new section, there's the final bar over here of a stable note. And you can see that this is in G sharp, which is the root note of the track. And this is also in G sharp, just an octave lower, which is also the root note of the track. And what you'll see later on is that I'm actually continuing to use that theme over here. So you can see here we have another melody that kind of flows. And then here there's another root note, in this case, again, G sharp at the lower octave. And then here over here, it's the same thing, but with the G sharp at the higher octave. So altogether, it's going to sound like that. And keep an eye out for how it actually helps flowing the track, this melody. You can hear that now finally I've developed this idea far enough that I can actually use it to control the energy level of my track. And overall, I think that my melodies are a little bit more cohesive with the rest of the track because of that. So that's it. That's how I've been finding my sounds. Of course, there's a lot more to my tracks than just the melodies, but this is at least a very big part of it, because these are the kind of elements that really stand out in your track and make your track sound unique, and therefore they have a lot of importance within the theme or the idea of the track. You can imagine one friend asking to another, hey, what is that track again that has that cool flute melody in it? Whereas for a lot of other elements in the track, that's not really the case. And that's really what we're talking about when you have a unique sound. That thing right there, something that can be quickly described by somebody that doesn't exactly know music production maybe. It is something that everybody understands and that everybody just gets and can use to actually identify your music from anybody else's music. So that's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something. If you want to support the channel, the best way to do that is by continue watching. So there will be 2 videos up on the screen right now. One is my last tutorial, the other one is recommended to you by YouTube. So just click one of them and enjoy the video. But that's going to be it for today. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.